I first learned to love context growing up, traveling with my dad. See, my dad, before he was in the military, did this thing where he would go on his own and fix cars. And a lot of the times, that would be a long trip to go fix the car. And being a little kid, I would get to go with him sometimes. And a lot of the times, that trip out to his job entailed listening to Kansas, Rush, Yngwie Malmsteen, any of those awesome classic rock and classic metal records. It was always curtailed with a, shh, don't tell your mother. But sometimes we would listen to this guy called Paul Harvey. And Paul Harvey was famous for this section that he did on the radio called The Rest of the Story. And what he would do is he would give you the context of something happening in the news. You would hear all kinds of context, a little bit of content, and at the very end, he would give you the person it was about. So now that you know all of the context, now he drops in the surprise of this is the person he was talking about all along. And then he would end with, and now you know the rest of the story. And I love stories. And context makes everything make way more sense. So whenever I teach, I want to give some good context to what we're doing. So today we're going to go into Genesis. And Genesis is a little weird book of the Bible. So we're going to start off with looking at what Genesis is. Genesis is the prologue of the Bible. Exodus is chapter 1. Genesis is all about how did we get here. Now remember, it's being written after the Exodus has actually happened. So the purpose of Genesis is to say, how did we get to Egypt, and why was it so bad that we had to leave? So it starts all the way back in the beginning. It goes through hundreds and hundreds of years, getting up all the way until we find this guy named Joseph. And we've all heard this story before. Joseph is the favorite son out of a lot of sons, from the favorite wife out of a couple wives. Not the best dad in the world, but as what comes when you favor one child above a whole bunch of others, the other brothers kind of notice, and they resent. And so Joseph gets beaten up. They want to kill him until one of them is like, hey, we shouldn't kill him. We should sell him. That way we get profit. And so they do that, and he ends up going to Egypt. And he becomes a slave for Potiphar. And Potiphar is in the Pharaoh's court. And Potiphar's wife goes, man, this Joseph's something else. And so she goes after him, and he rejects her. And then she cries foul, and he ends up in prison. In prison, he interprets dreams. It's great for the person whose dream is good. It's bad for the person whose dream is bad. Eventually, they forget about him until all of a sudden Pharaoh has dreams, and nobody can figure them out. And so that's when, oh, right, there's this guy named Joseph. Let's go get him. Joseph comes. He reveals the meaning of the dream. There's going to be really, really good years, and then there's going to be a famine. Pharaoh says, all right, I'm going to put you in charge of everything. You're going to be able to boss me around for everything except this little area of my power. That'll still be over you. But other than that, you tell me to do something, I'll jump. And then Joseph's brothers come. Famine hits. It hits hard. Egypt's fine. Joseph's brothers are not. They're not in Egypt. So they come. Joseph tests his brothers. His brothers prove that they have changed their ways. They have become men of better character. And because of that, Joseph forgives them. He reveals himself. And then he says, bring the whole family here. Don't leave them to die where the famine is. Bring them here. And they do. And the way we normally end the story is that Jacob comes. All the brothers are there. They all settle in Egypt. Everything's fine. And then sometime later, things are really bad in Egypt. They forgot all about Joseph and things are really bad. What that telling leaves out is a couple chapters, 3 chapters, that are powerful chapters. And we are all lesser for leaving them out of our narrative. So we're going to explore them. Now, I could just read the whole 3 chapters here, and it would be awesome, but it would be boring. So I'm going to summarize and then bring your attention to a couple parts to really get home what the point of all this is. Remember, this is written for a purpose. Why are we in Egypt? What is the point of all of this? So, things aren't great. There is a famine. Things suck. We had a lot of grain, but, you need to trade for the grain. So Egypt starts bringing all of their money, and they run out of money. At this time, Egypt isn't unified. There's a pharaoh, but they're all kind of in these separate communities. These communities are getting together. They're bringing all of their resources. They start with money. They run out of money. They go, Joseph, we have no money, but we need to eat. Joseph says, all right, give me your livestock. They bring all their livestock, and then they're like, we still need to eat. We have nothing left. Eventually, it gets to the point where they sell themselves into servitude to the pharaoh. And this is how Joseph unites all of Egypt. All of Egypt, except the priests, are under the pharaoh's rule as servants, as citizens. He gives them a tax. He gives them a 20% tax on everything. He says, I will give you supplies for you to make your own stuff, for you to grow your own food. But you're going to give Pharaoh a 20% cut. Now, I don't know how many of you look at your taxes. 20% is not that bad. It's very livable, especially for a whole community. Joseph has made himself the uniter of Egypt. He is a great man. His father is even greater because Joseph looks up to his father. And so even Pharaoh treats his father as an equal. This is huge. Pharaoh, if you're not familiar with ancient Egypt, Pharaoh considers himself a living deity on earth. He's connected to the gods. And this God among men treats the patriarch of Joseph's family as an equal. So let's jump into some text here. Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was so severe. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made them servants from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests did he not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from the Pharaoh, and they lived on that allowance. Therefore, they did not sell their land. Now that's going to come out big in Exodus. This is a little detail for helping out chapter 1. When the pharaohs are when the priests are such a problem, they're allowed to be such a problem because they're not really united in the same way. Then Joseph said to the people, behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed, and you will sow the land. At harvest you will give a fifth, and 4/5 will be your own, as seed for the field and as food for yourselves and your households, as food for even your little ones. And they said, you have saved our lives. May it please my Lord that we will be servants to Pharaoh. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt that stands to this day. The Pharaoh should have a fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become the Pharaoh's. This fifth extends to public works. A fifth of their year, every Egyptian citizen does public works. This is how the Israelites end up getting so ingrained, where we get this image, as historically inaccurate as it is, of Hebrews building pyramids. Because with bricks, they're building roads. You see, when they got in to Egypt, it was only supposed to be for a short time. Joseph sets his family up to say that they're shepherds. And this means that they're not going to be immigrants. They're just going to live on the land for a little while. But the Israelites get comfortable. They become citizens. And as citizens, they move into the servitude. But first, we have to deal with some other stuff that happens. Jacob is mortal, and he dies. To get a picture of how important he is, let's take a look at this. Joseph commands his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. That means they mummified him. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many were required for the embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him for 70 days. 70 days. 2 months and some change. Can you weep for someone you don't personally know for over 2 months? This guy's a big deal. And it's because he's this big of a deal that we get into the root of what this end of Genesis has to give to us. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil for you. And now, please forgive the transgressions of the servants of God of your father." Before I go on, they're sending somebody else. Joseph is this big of a deal. He very easily can make retribution happen with just the snap of his fingers. It's not quite the dramatic show of them bursting into dust as Thanos, but that's the level of power that Joseph has. This is why they're so afraid. They're not even willing to go themselves. And I encourage you to read these 3 chapters on your own, because what you'll find as you read is that they're making this story up. We have long, intense pages of dialogue where we see Joseph at his father's side at every moment of his dying. So this is basically his brother saying, "Hey, for those 2 seconds you passed out, Dad said this to us. I know you. It was 2 seconds. You weren't there. He was there the whole time. He knows this is a lie." How does he respond? He weeps. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Jesus wept. So famous. Sorry. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also then came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." Reminds you a bit of the prodigal son coming back to his father, preparing that speech, throwing himself down for the mercy. "Don't treat me as family, treat me as a servant. I don't deserve to be family, but have mercy on me and treat me as an employee." But Joseph says, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Am I in the place of God? Joseph has this intense understanding of sin that his brothers don't. Remember, this is the second reconciliation. Joseph has already said to them, "It was not you who sent me to Egypt, it was God." Now we have this, what you meant as evil, God turned to good. Joseph realizes it is not his place to seek retribution. Because Joseph sees, looking in hindsight, that because of what his brothers did, yeah, it sucked, but it made for the salvation of the whole family and of all of Egypt and of the surrounding nations. See, See, what this text shows us is that the way we tend to see sin is flawed. We tend to see sin the way the brothers do. Got my fancy little illustration here. We have two categories of sin. Logically, we don't think we do, but practically we do. We have, all right, this is the sin that is just between me and God. So if I sin against God, I got to deal with God, get his forgiveness, deal with that, and we're cool. Then we have our sins with other people. Okay, I've wronged this person over here. I have to go and reconcile. But then I'm good. What Joseph tells us is that there is a missing step. All sin is sin against God. The brothers had already reconciled, but they were still feeling guilty. They had not reached out and reconciled themselves with God. So the guilt weighed upon them because they were not done. Every sin is sin against God. Joseph says it himself. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? When he's talking to Potiphar's wife. Joseph immediately knows that it is not just Potiphar he would be sinning against. It would be God. And I just don't think we think that way. I think we fall into the trap of, okay, I said I'm sorry, he forgave me, I'm done. Genesis is telling us that's not the case. We have to bring all retribution to all injured parties. We have to deal with God. I found these 4 points out of the end of Genesis. These are the 4 lessons, I think, is the whole point of telling the story of how the brothers came back a second time. So the first thing, like I said, all sin is sin against God. Number 2, you need to reconcile with both God and man, not just one or the other. 3, you need to accept forgiveness. I don't think Joseph's brothers ever accepted the forgiveness they were offered. 4, model yourself after Joseph. Forgive and trust that no sin messes up God's plan. Joseph never begrudges his brothers in the entire story of his fate. Not from the time he is picked up by the slave traders to the time that he is confronting them in Egypt. At all times, whenever he talks about them, he has forgiven them. He trusts that God's way is bigger than what he can see now. He sits in prison for years, trusting that God is bigger than the bad circumstances he's found himself in. Do we have Joseph's level of faith? We have way more reason to believe in God than Joseph did. God has way more pages and chapters in the Bible where he has shown himself faithful. He may have showed up in your own life and shown himself to be faithful. Do we truly trust him to be faithful in the midst of the hurt and the pain that someone else's sin has caused or that your own sin has caused? Do we think that there is something we could do that could separate us from God? Jesus made the way. I challenge you to have Joseph's level of faith. Try living with it. Examine your life. Look for where you don't trust. Where you're clenching on and you're like, no, God, I've got this one. You take care of other stuff. I've got this handled. Challenge you to look into that. Let's go to God.